It happens in silence, not with a scream, not with a sword, but with a smile. You stand in the room, plans in motion, surrounded by people who nod in agreement, raise glasses in approval, and shake your hand with unwavering confidence. One of them smiles more warmly than the rest, a trusted friend and ally. They look at you the way people look at those they admire, calm, steady, loyal, but something is wrong later, when it all unravels, when the deal collapses. When your enemies know what only a few were told, you realize the truth. The betrayal didn't begin with anger. It began with reassurance, and the smile you remember most was the one that lied. History is full of betrayals that didn't shout. They whispered, they played friendly, they wore masks. Brutus didn't plunge the knife first. He stood closest, waited longest, and struck only when the timing was perfect. Judas didn't break ranks. He kissed Jesus on the cheek. The deadliest lie is the one you never see coming. So how do you see it? That question is not just paranoia, it is survival, and one man knew it better than Machiavelli for centuries. He has been misunderstood, cast as the godfather of manipulation, the defender of ruthless power. But that's not the full picture. Machiavelli wasn't just a strategist. He was a realist, a man who understood that deception isn't rare. It's constant. It's not a failure of character, it's a function of it. People lie not because they're monsters, but because it works. Machiavelli saw this not as cynicism, but as clarity too. Believe everyone tells the truth is not moral. It's dangerous. To wait until you're betrayed to recognize deceit is not noble, it's naive. And so, he gave us tools, not to deceive, but to detect, not to manipulate, but to see manipulation for what it is, clearly, early, ruthlessly. This film isn't about becoming a liar. It's about identifying one before they become your downfall. What if you could see the cracks in the mask before it slips? What if you could expose the lie while the liar still believes they're winning? Through Machiavelli's forgotten lens, we'll uncover the 7 subtle tactics that reveal deception, not with drama, but with precision, techniques designed not for dominance, but for defense in a world built on appearances. Because in a world of smiling liars, survival begins the moment you stop trusting the smile. The truth doesn't come naturally. That's the uncomfortable reality. From the earliest stages of life, long before children understand arithmetic or ethics, they learn how to deceive, not by accident, by instinct. A study led by Dr. Kang Lee at the University of Toronto found that most children begin lying around the age of 2 or 3, not because they are taught to, but because lying offers a clear advantage. It buys time, it avoids punishment, it creates possibility, and from that first instinctual lie, the skill only sharpens by adulthood. The average person lies between once and twice a day. Most of these are small, socially acceptable, what psychologists call prosocial lies. But that doesn't make them harmless, it makes them invisible. And it's precisely that invisibility that creates danger. Paul Ekman, the psychologist who pioneered the field of lie detection, spent decades studying microexpressions, the brief, involuntary facial expressions that betray our real feelings. His research proved something that Machiavelli intuited centuries earlier. People rarely tell the full truth. Even when they believe they are lying isn't a glitch in the human system. It's a feature. Evolutionary biologists explain this as a survival trait. In competitive environments, deception creates an edge. If food is scarce, if predators are near, or if power is at stake, those who can manipulate perception gain an advantage. Camouflage is not only a strategy of nature, it's a reflection of human psychology. And in society, that camouflage becomes verbal, political, personal. Consider the prophets and kings of history, religious leaders who claimed divine visions they couldn't prove, rulers who preached justice while silencing dissent, even democratic leaders who sold wars under the banner of peace. These weren't anomalies, they were strategic communicators. Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that transparency had its limits. You can't tell the people everything, he once said, because then you'd tell your enemies too. Abraham Lincoln, often remembered for his honesty, was known to mislead when it served a higher goal. Before issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he publicly downplayed any intention of freeing slaves, not because he didn't believe in it, but because premature honesty would have splintered the fragile Union. Even modern leaders aren't exempt. John F. Kennedy, Barack Obama, Donald Trump all relied on controlled messaging, omission, misdirection, precision. This isn't unique to politics. In relationships, business, education, even therapy, truth is filtered, framed, managed, sometimes to protect, often to manipulate. And yet, we cling to the myth that honesty is the norm, that when someone speaks, we're hearing their real thoughts, that transparency is default, that lies are rare. But Machiavelli disagreed. He saw the world as it was, not as we wished it to be. In his view, expecting honesty was not a sign of moral purity, it was a sign of poor judgment. He warned that those in power, princes, statesmen, generals, must assume deception as the baseline, because only by accepting that everyone lies can you begin to separate appearance from reality. To him, truth was not the default. It was the exception, and those who believed otherwise, they were the first to fall. The naive, the idealists, the leaders who mistook appearances for loyalty, words for intentions. In The Prince, Machiavelli doesn't simply tell rulers to lie. He explains that everyone already is. The battlefield is not one of morality, it's one of clarity. He understood that the real danger isn't the liar, it's the person who doesn't recognize the lie. This is where survival begins, not with mistrust, but with recognition, because once you accept that lying is human, you stop searching for saints, you stop assuming sincerity, you start observing, listening not just to what is said, but to what is avoided, contradicted, or conveniently delayed. You start asking, not just what are they saying, but why are they saying it now? In Machiavelli's world, and in ours, truth is not something you are given. It's something you extract, and to extract it, you must stop expecting it. Only then do the masks begin to slip. Only then does deception reveal itself, not in loud, obvious moments, but in subtle inconsistencies, calculated omissions, and perfectly timed performances. To lead, to protect, to survive, you must begin with this rule: everyone lies. The difference is whether you see it coming. Every liar eventually forgets what they said, but the truth never does. This was one of Machiavelli's quietest insights, hidden between the lines of The Prince, unspoken yet ever present. He knew that a lie must constantly evolve to remain hidden. And in that evolution, it begins to fracture. Deception is unstable. It relies on memory, calculation, emotional control. The truth, by contrast, is simple. It doesn't change, it doesn't have to be rehearsed. It survives scrutiny because it was never assembled, it was revealed. Machiavelli understood this long before psychology would give it a name. Centuries later, neuroscience would confirm it. Lies are cognitively demanding. They require the brain to do more work, to create a false story, suppress the real one, monitor the listener's reaction, and maintain emotional consistency. The more complex the lie, the more fragile it becomes, and fragility creates cracks. Look closely enough, and those cracks start to show. In 1998, President Bill Clinton famously declared, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." The phrasing was absolute denial. Not ambiguity, but under pressure. His wording shifted in a later deposition. He parsed the meaning of the word "is." The public noticed, the media dissected, and the contradiction, the small fracture in the wall, became the opening through which the entire truth emerged. It wasn't the act that undid him, it was the inconsistency in the corporate world. The same pattern holds. Take the case of Elizabeth Holmes and Tyrannos. At first, her statements were visionary. A single drop of blood, a revolutionary machine, results in minutes. But then came the questions, details that didn't add up. Shifting explanation of what the technology could actually do as journalists pressed and former employees leaked. Her story changed, just slightly, but enough. The contradiction was the first spark, The collapse followed even in personal relationships. Contradiction is the alarm bell. We ignore a partner says they were working late, but they post from a bar. A friend claims to support you, but later jokes about your failures to someone else. The lie isn't always in the action, it's in the difference between what was said then and what's said now. Machiavelli would urge us not to confront it immediately, but to remember it, to store it like evidence, because contradiction is the liar's shadow. It follows them, even when they think no one's watching. So how do you train yourself to see it? First, listen not for facts, but for patterns. The first story is the baseline. Every update afterward must match in tone, detail, and intent. If it doesn't pause, ask why. The liar may adjust the narrative slightly. A time change, a detail swapped, an emotional shift that doesn't fit the moment. Second, watch the emotional response. If someone reacts with unusual defensiveness or intensity when asked to clarify a minor detail, it may not be the question that bothers them. It's the memory of the lie. Truth flows. Lies, etymicro contradictions, are often brushed off as forgetfulness. But forgetfulness doesn't usually change intent, it changes trivia. When the deeper meaning shifts, that's where deception begins to glow in the dark. Machiavelli's mind was forged in a world of deadly stakes. Florence, in the 5th-10th century, was not kind to those who misread character. Political betrayal meant exile or worse to survive. Machiavelli had to develop a sixth sense, not for what was said in the palace halls, but for what contradicted what had already been said. His gift wasn't paranoia, it was precision. He didn't assume everyone was lying. He simply assumed that if they were, they wouldn't be able to hold it together forever, and they didn't. If someone contradicts themselves once, it's a warning. If they do it twice, it's a pattern. If they do it 3 times, it's a strategy. The first rule of uncovering deception isn't confrontation. It's collection. Pattern recognition, quiet clarity, because while the liar may lie with confidence, their confidence will eventually betray them. You just have to wait for the contradiction and trust it when it comes. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who never raise their voice. They smile, they serve, they give, and when they speak, their words are soaked in morality, goodness, and virtue. They say the right things, they care about justice. They love peace. They want what's best for everyone, but behind the curtain, the reality is often very different. Machiavelli warned us about this in The Prince. He wrote that a ruler must learn how not to be good and yet appear utterly virtuous. Appearances, he argued, are tools. Morality is optional. What matters is utility, how the illusion of virtue can be wielded like a weapon. The excessive display of goodness is rarely about goodness at all. It's about strategy. This is not a cynical claim. It's an observable pattern, a tactic repeated across time, institutions, and ideologies. Take the case of Jim Jones, a preacher, a visionary, a supposed prophet of equality and racial justice. His church was seen as a utopia of inclusivity. He spoke of compassion, of loyalty, of sacrifice, and yet, beneath that layer of saintly devotion, he orchestrated one of the largest mass murders in history, over 900 people dead. Not because they followed a monster, but because they followed a man who seemed too good to be one. He cloaked his darkness in virtue, and it worked. History is littered with similar contradictions. The politician who speaks of transparency while operating in secrecy. The CEO who posts about corporate ethics while exploiting labor behind closed doors. The activist who champions justice but bullies anyone who disagrees. Why does this work? Because humans are conditioned to associate goodness with safety. From a young age, we're taught to trust the kind voice, the generous hand, the person who says the right thing. But Machiavelli saw this instinct as a vulnerability, a loophole. In the human mind, he understood what modern psychology now confirms. Liars often overcompensate. The more someone wants to be trusted, the more likely they are to perform trustworthiness. They smile more. They speak in absolutes. They declare their honesty preemptively. They volunteer virtue where it wasn't asked for. This is not just a psychological quirk. It's a survival strategy. Overcompensation creates a shield. It makes people hesitate. It makes them feel guilty for doubting. After all, how can you question someone who just donated to charity? Who cried during a speech? Who claims to be on the side of truth? But Machiavelli would urge us to do exactly that. He argued that it is more important for a ruler to appear merciful, faithful, humane, and religious than to actually be those things. Because people judge by appearances. They do not see inside hearts. They see actions, symbols, performances. And the performance of virtue often hides a ruthless calculation underneath. This tactic has not disappeared. It's just changed costume in the age of social media. The mask of virtue is easier to wear than ever. Anyone can post a quote about empathy. Anyone can signal moral superiority with a hashtag. Public declarations of values are everywhere, but the follow-through rarely matches. Machiavelli would look at this not with contempt, but with recognition. Virtue in excess becomes a brand, and brands exist not to be honest, but to be consumed. So how can you spot the liar behind the mask of goodness? Look for intensity without substance when someone is too perfect, too agreeable, too aligned with what you want to hear. Pause and notice if their words are louder than their actions. Pay attention to the emotional weight of their declarations. Real virtue is often quiet. It doesn't need a spotlight. It doesn't need to prove itself constantly. When someone feels the need to declare their honesty, their loyalty, their selflessness, ask why. Ask what they gain from being perceived that way. The dangerous lie isn't the one that contradicts virtue. It's the one that pretends to be virtue. Machiavelli never said virtue was useless. He simply believed it was too rare to rely on, that in a world of deception, appearances mattered more than intentions, and that those who appeared virtuous were often the most cunning of all. He offered this truth not to justify evil, but to protect against illusion. In his time, survival meant knowing who was wearing a mask. Today, the stakes are different, but the method is the same. Influence is currency, perception is power, and deception thrives in the form of exaggerated righteousness. So beware the person who looks too clean, too polished, too flawless, because just as darkness casts a shadow, excessive light can also blind you. True integrity doesn't announce itself. It simply exists quietly, consistently, without needing applause. And in a world full of performers, those are the ones worth watching, the others the ones who wrap themselves in virtue like armor may not be who they seem, and Machiavelli would tell you, they almost never are. Words are easy, eyes are not. We live in a world built on language contracts, speeches, declarations of love, loyalty, and leadership. But the body doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks in signals. It stutters with tension. It leaks the truth through the smallest flicker of movement. And Machiavelli, centuries before neuroscience gave it a name, understood this with unnerving clarity. In The Prince, Machiavelli rarely discusses promises. He doesn't trust them. What he values is behavior, because words can be sculpted actions, though especially unconscious ones reveal intent. And when you train yourself to look past the performance, the cracks begin to show. Modern science now confirms what Machiavelli instinctively knew. The body never lies. R. Paul Ekman, one of the leading psychologists in lie detection, pioneered the study of micro-expressions, involuntary facial movements that flash across the face in less than 1/5 of a second. These tiny expressions are incredibly hard to control and often contradict what someone is verbally expressing. Imagine someone saying, "I'm not angry," while for a millisecond, a flash of contempt flickers across their face, or someone insisting, "I'm happy for you," while their eyes narrow in disgust. The voice might lie, the eyes might smile, but the muscles betray something else. This is where deception begins to unravel. Take pupil dilation. It's almost impossible to control consciously when someone is lying. Especially under pressure, their pupils often dilate. It's a stress response, a survival reflex. The nervous system is preparing for danger, because lying, even when skillful, is a risk. Another clue is eye contact, or the avoidance of it. Contrary to popular belief, liars don't always look away, some overcompensate. Staring too directly, holding eye contact unnaturally long. Why? Because they know they're being watched, and they're trying too hard to appear sincere. The truth doesn't need to try. Liars often forget this. And then there's facial leakage. When one part of the face betrays the emotion, the rest is trying. To hide a forced smile may hold, but the eyes tighten, the forehead creases in worry, the jaw clenches slightly. Even as the words say everything's fine, Machiavelli would have called this the mask slipping. He would have watched the body. Not the rhetoric in courtrooms, palaces, backdoor negotiations. It wasn't the speech he trusted. It was the behavior surrounding the speech. The nervous glance, the stuttered breath, the moment someone touches their face just a second too long after telling you what you want to hear, because under pressure, the body reverts to instinct, and instinct reveals fear, shame, guilt, even delight, if someone is enjoying their deception. One historic example is the Watergate scandal. Richard Nixon's denial was firm. His words were carefully constructed, but body language experts reviewing footage of his public statements observed subtle inconsistencies, tightened lips, shifting eyes, downward glances. His discomfort leaked through, and eventually the words crumbled with it. Even trained spies understand this principle in intelligence agencies. Agents are taught to observe behavior before language, hand movements, breathing rate, facial tension. The idea is simple. Speech can be rehearsed. The body cannot. This tactic, watch the eyes, not the words, is not just useful in politics. It applies in everyday life. A friend makes a promise, but their eyes drift sideways. A coworker assures you of support, but their jaw tightens every time your name is mentioned in meetings. A partner says everything's fine, but their posture stiffens when certain topics arise. It's not about paranoia. It's about perception. Machiavelli wasn't telling you to mistrust everyone. He was telling you where to look when something feels wrong. The key is stillness. Observation, discomfort, reveals itself in patterns. Excessive blinking, fidgeting, shallow breathing. Words might say one thing, but the rhythm of the body says something else entirely. Here's a simple method to train this awareness. Step 1. Establish a baseline. How does this person behave when relaxed and truthful? What's their normal tone, posture, cadence? Step 2. Observe deviation. Do they suddenly speak faster? Blink more? Avoid answering directly? Step 3. Notice clusters. One sign means little, but several signs together in a high-stakes moment paint a picture. The eyes are particularly revealing, according to Ekman. The emotion of fear most commonly leaks through the eyes before any other part of the face. Wide eyes, raised upper eyelids, a sudden glance toward the door, the exit, the clock. Machiavelli would see that glance not as random, but as revelation. Lear's fear is not of the lie. It's of the moment you notice the lies. Oh, they try harder. They speak more. They insist. They perform. The eyes always tell the truth in a world obsessed with words, interviews, tweets, statements, speeches. This tactic is your edge. Don't just listen, watch. The ones who lie best speak with conviction, but they betray themselves in motion. A glance, a pause, a breath they didn't mean to take. And once you learn to see that, you don't need to argue, you don't need to accuse, you just know. And in that knowing lies the power Machiavelli spoke of, the power to remain silent, observant, and dangerous, while everyone else is still busy believing what they're told. Truth doesn't need time to think. When someone asks you your name, you don't pause. When asked where you were last night, and the answer is simple, you don't stall. Your memory retrieves the information instantly. Your body doesn't need to rehearse, because the truth lives at the surface. But when the truth threatens to expose something, the liar hesitates. Machiavelli understood this long before psychology gave it language. In his world of diplomacy, war, and betrayal, timing was everything. He called it tempo, the strategic rhythm of decision-making. To him, delays under pressure weren't just signs of weakness. They were signs of internal conflict. signals that something beneath the surface was struggling to maintain coherence. When someone pauses before a simple answer, they're not accessing memory, they're manufacturing it. This idea is echoed in modern interrogation rooms. Investigators don't just listen for what a suspect says, they measure how long it takes them to say it. When an innocent person is asked a factual question, "Did you go to the store?" their answer is swift, but when guilt is present, a pause emerges, not always long, sometimes just a few seconds. But in those seconds, the liar is mentally reviewing consequences, testing reactions, selecting a version of the truth that's safest to say aloud in high-profile press briefings. This hesitation is amplified. Consider the case of Lance Armstrong. For years, the world believed his story, a cancer survivor turned cycling champion, preaching discipline and perseverance. But when journalists began pressing on doping allegations, his answers became less immediate, more rehearsed. When asked directly whether he had used performance-enhancing drugs, the delay was slight, but it was there, just long enough to be unnatural, just long enough to be noticed later. When the full truth came out, people pointed to that pause, that moment of calculation, that delay that betrayed. This is a pattern. It repeats in politics, business, and personal relationships. A delay before a yes, a vague deflection after a no, a moment too long before answering a question that requires no real thought. Because deception isn't just about lies, it's about buying time to arrange them. Machiavelli would have called this hesitation dangerous, not because it's morally wrong, but because it reveals instability in the narrative. In a world built on control, a delayed response is a crack, and cracks spread. He believed that decisive action was a form of power. When you know your intention, you move quickly. When your intentions are hidden or fragmented, you stall. You disguise your delay as caution, as diplomacy. But beneath that mask, the truth stutters. Modern behavioral studies confirm this. Researchers at Harvard found that liars tend to speak more slowly and with more hesitations than truth tellers. Their minds are working harder, constructing, editing, adapting in real time. This doesn't mean every slow answer is a lie, but in moments of scrutiny, the gap between question and answer becomes revealing. So how can you detect this in everyday life? Watch for unnecessary delays following questions that don't require thinking. Notice if someone repeats your question back to you, a common stalling tactic. Observe filler words. "Well, that's an interesting question." These aren't always lies, but when combined with other signs, shifts in tone, eye movement, micro-contradictions, they form a pattern. This pattern was critical to Machiavelli. In his writings, he emphasized the importance of tempo, not only in speech but in war, leadership, and diplomacy. A prince who delays too long loses initiative, but a prince who moves decisively, even if immorally, often gains control to him. Delay under pressure signaled uncertainty, and in politics, uncertainty was dangerous today. The stakes may differ, but the signal remains. In courtrooms, during job interviews, in moments of confrontation, those extra seconds are loud. They whisper, "Something isn't right here," and when you listen closely, that whisper grows. This is not about becoming cynical, it's about becoming observant, because the people who manipulate most effectively don't just lie with confidence, they lie with timing. They try to control not just what you hear, but when and once you see the delay for what it is, not hesitation, but calculation, you start to take back control. Machiavelli's wisdom was not to judge people for lying. He assumed they would. His genius was to recognize how they'd reveal themselves despite it. So the next time someone pauses just a little too long before answering, don't rush them, don't interrupt, just watch in their silence. You'll hear everything you need. Truth survives repetition. Lies do not. This tactic is simple, almost too simple, which is why it's so often overlooked. But Machiavelli would have seen its brilliance immediately, not because it's loud or confrontational, but because it's quiet, surgical, a pressure test that doesn't need violence or drama. Just patience. Ask the same question, then ask it again. not immediately, not identically, just differently enough to seem unrelated, and then wait, because liars rarely lie the same way twice in the world of espionage and interrogation. This technique is a standard tool. Intelligence agencies train operatives to detect inconsistencies by carefully repeating questions over the span of an interview. It's not about tripping someone up with aggression. It's about watching them build their own trap when someone is telling the truth. The story stays intact, no matter how you slice it. The sequence remains. The emotion is consistent. The details don't shift under pressure. But when someone is fabricating, each retelling introduces a crack, a change in time, a missing name. An emotional tone that doesn't match because lies aren't stored in memory. They're built on the spot. They're art projects, not records, and art is hard to replicate without leaving behind inconsistencies. Machiavelli thrived in a world of courtiers and shifting alliances, where truth was currency and deception was everywhere. He would have used this tactic like a blade, not by confronting, but by listening closely, allowing the speaker to speak twice, then measuring the distance between their words. Consider a historical example. Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal. In various interviews and public statements, he addressed the break-in and the subsequent cover-up, but each time he was questioned weeks apart, sometimes months. His phrasing changed, his explanations wobbled, the smallest details began to contradict one another. The strategy failed not because he admitted guilt, but because the lie couldn't hold under repetition now. Compare that to whistleblowers or truth-tellers under pressure. They might be emotional. They might stammer, but the core story doesn't shift, even when retold in fear or exhaustion. It stands because truth doesn't need editing. Social engineers, those who manipulate through deception, fear this tactic. Why? Because their narrative is only built for one version of the moment. Repetition forces them to recreate something they only partially constructed in the first place. In personal life, this tactic is just as effective. You ask a partner where they were last night, at a friend's house. A few days later, you ask who they were with. If the story is true, the answer matches effortlessly. If not, it stumbles because it wasn't stored, it was invented, and inventions don't always come out of the box the same way twice. It doesn't take aggression, just memory, just attention. Ask in different contexts. Reframe the question. Note how the story flows or phrase. Machiavelli would say, don't react, don't correct them, just collect. Let the contradiction build its own weight, because every lie is a structure, and every structure, once cracked, collapses from within. This is the kind of tactic Machiavelli loved, not flashy, but inevitable. He believed that power came from understanding patterns, not from forcing outcomes, and when someone lies, they interrupt their own pattern. Your job is to let them, so next time someone gives you an answer that feels too smooth, too certain, wait, then ask again, casually from a different angle, and listen not just to what they say, but to whether they can say it again. Sometimes truth whispers, but lies they shout when someone is hiding something. Their greatest fear is not being discovered, it's being suspected, and the moment suspicion enters the room, their behavior changes, not with subtle tension, but with emotional overdrive. They snap, they panic, they overreact. A small question becomes an interrogation. A raised eyebrow becomes an accusation, and suddenly, they're the victim, you are the villain, and the truth? It's buried beneath noise. Psychologists call this emotional incongruence. When the emotional response doesn't match the situation, it's common in people hiding guilt, shame, or fear, because when the lie is fragile, any challenge, no matter how small, feels like a threat to the entire structure. Machiavelli understood this dynamic intuitively. He wrote that men are driven by two things, fear and ambition. And when fear is triggered, especially the fear of being exposed, it rarely hides quietly. It explodes. Think of Senator Joseph McCarthy during the Red Scare. At first, his crusade against communism seemed grounded in patriotism, but as he was challenged lightly, cautiously, His responses grew louder, angrier, more irrational. He didn't just defend himself. He attacked. Anyone who questioned his narrative became the enemy. The overreaction revealed more than guilt. It revealed desperation. This is the psychology of projection. When someone feels vulnerable, they often redirect, accuse before being accused, raise the stakes, control the narrative by making others afraid to ask again. And that's the key. The disproportionate reaction is not about truth. It's about control. Watch carefully in your own life. When you ask a question gently, curiously, and someone lashes out, take note if the reaction seems designed to make you feel ashamed for asking. You've likely touched something real. The liar doesn't fear confrontation. They fear calm confrontation. Because calmness is power, it signals confidence, and confidence, when faced with deception, creates panic. Machiavelli would advise this. Do not match their volume. Do not rise to meet their chaos. Observe. Let them unravel. The louder they get, the more clearly their intentions are revealed. Because the truth doesn't need a show. It stands on its own. But the lie? It performs. It exaggerates. It fights to be believed, and in that fight it exposes itself. Not every lie is spoken. Some of the most dangerous ones are never said at all. It's easy to focus on what someone says. Words are visible, obvious. They draw attention. They become headlines, sound bites, statements of record. But often, the truth isn't hidden inside the message. It's hidden in what the message carefully avoids. Machiavelli, ever the strategist, understood this deeply in The Prince. He warned not just of deception through speech, but of deception through silence, the calculated omission, the carefully curated version of events, the story that feels complete, but leaves just enough unsaid to mislead. Because a good liar doesn't need to fabricate, they just need to selectively reveal. Think of a modern press conference after a scandal. The speaker stands behind a podium, flanked by flags and formality. They offer sympathy, express regret, promise change, but if you listen closely, something is missing. They don't mention timelines, they avoid names. They never address the precise allegations. The statement feels full, but it's hollow. The lie isn't in what they said, it's in what they didn't dare to say. This tactic thrives in corporate communication too. When a major company lays off employees, the public statement might focus on strategic restructuring, long-term vision, or realignment of priorities. Nowhere do they say profits dropped. Nowhere do they mention failure. The omissions aren't accidents, they're strategic, because the moment you control the frame, you control the perception. Political speeches follow the same logic. A candidate promises jobs, dignity, and freedom, but they never define how they invoke unity without naming the causes of division. They offer solutions without identifying the real problems. Again, the power isn't in what's said. It's in what's missing. Machiavelli would nod. He knew that silence, used skillfully, is not passive, it's a weapon. But how do you see what isn't there? You reverse your attention. Instead of asking, "What did they say?" ask, "What would a truthful person have included that this person didn't?" If someone tells you a story about their day but never mentions a place you know they went, or a person they were supposed to meet, that's a clue, not because they denied anything, but because the truth is too absent to be coincidence. Omissions protect the liar. Because omissions are hard to confront, you can challenge a false statement. But how do you argue with silence? That's the genius of this tactic, and that's why recognizing it takes a different kind of listening. Train yourself to hear the outline of the conversation, not just its center. Ask, what questions were avoided? What parts of the story feel vague or unfinished? What details were brushed aside or drowned in unrelated facts? This tactic was visible in the Snowden revelations. The government's response wasn't outright denial, it was a flood of technicalities, legal jargon, national security language. But the real issue, the violation of trust and privacy, was largely left unspoken, not denied, not defended, just omitted. And in that silence, The truth echoed louder than any speech. Machiavelli believed that deception is not always loud often. It's quiet. It sits in the background. It leaves blanks. It lets the listener fill in the gaps with assumptions, with hope, with distraction. Wise don't just listen for lies. They listen for absence. So, the next time someone tells you a story, don't just follow the words. Follow the shadows behind the words. What wasn't asked? What wasn't clarified? What was too quickly resolved? Because silence is not always ignorance. Sometimes it's design, and once you learn to hear what's missing, you'll never be deceived by what's spoken again. There is no way to eliminate deception from the world, but there is a way to remove its power by recognizing it. This is what Machiavelli truly offered. Not a guide to corruption, but a manual for navigating it. He didn't write for tyrants. He wrote for survivors, for those who lived in a world where masks ruled, and where truth was often the most fragile thing in the room. To understand deception is not to become evil, it's to become immune. Throughout history, those who ruled did so not by honesty, but by perception. Kings, popes, presidents, they didn't ascend by telling the whole truth. They rose by shaping belief, by hiding intent, by controlling timing, silence, expression, and contradiction. But the lesson here is not to become one of them. The lesson is to see them for what they are, and choose differently. Blind trust is not a virtue, it's a vulnerability. We're told that to question others is to be cynical, that to doubt is to lack faith, that suspicion is toxic. But in a world ruled by performance, those who cannot see the script will always be pulled by the strings. Machiavelli did not teach people to lie. He taught people to stop assuming they were ever being told the truth. In politics, in business, in relationships, power flows not from force, but from narrative. The one who sees the lie first isn't necessarily the one who confronts it. Sometimes, the greatest power is in silence, in letting the lie exist, without letting it enter you. When you see the subtle contradiction, you gain control. When you notice the overreaction, you gain leverage. When you hear what's missing, you become unshakable. When you ask twice and the answer shifts, you don't need to argue. You've already won. Machiavelli's greatest insight wasn't that people deceive, was that deception follows patterns, and that once you learn to recognize those patterns, you no longer need to fear them, because awareness is the antidote. This doesn't mean living in paranoia. It means living with clarity, knowing when the performance starts, knowing when the truth ends, and most importantly, knowing when not to speak, not to react, not to give away what you know. The person who sees the lie, but says nothing, often holds more power than the liar himself, because the liar needs you to believe. But when you see through them and remain composed, you become the one in control. This is the quiet strength. Machiavelli pointed to not domination, not manipulation, but perceptive detachment. He lived in a brutal age where power meant life or death. Yet even in that world, he didn't preach chaos, he preached strategy. His message wasn't be cruel, it was know when cruelty is being disguised as kindness. His wisdom wasn't permission to lie. It was protection from the lies already around you today. The lies are more subtle, more polished, delivered through algorithms, wrapped in moral language, framed by smiling faces and carefully rehearsed tones. But the patterns remain, and so does your weapon. Attention. You don't need to call them out. You don't need to expose them publicly. You just need to see, because once you see, you can never be controlled again. You cannot stop every manipulator, but you can stop them from using you. And in a world full of performance, that is the ultimate rebellion. Not to speak louder, but to listen deeper. Not to trust less, but to recognize more. And not to fear the liar, but to ensure they never hold power over you again. Leave a comment below. What part resonated most with you? Or better yet, what did you feel but didn't expect to? And if you know someone who's been underestimated too long, share this with them. Because in a world obsessed with volume, the ones who whisper with weight are the ones truly remembered. Stay sharp, stay unreadable, and I'll see you in the next one.